Hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog. And today we are reading Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, starting with Part 3, Chapter 16. I immediately forgot. It might be 16. It might not be 16. Chapter 18. Chapter 18. But first, reading updates. I am reading The Wager by David Gran. I'm reading it because it won for Best Nonfiction in 2023, and it is about this ship called the Wager, and they are going out trying to find this Spanish galleon, which is like the treasure of all of the seas, and everything is terrible. There are far too many people packed on this ship. They have scurvy. They have typhus. Um, they have been shipwrecked. Possibly a mutiny is going on or is about to happen, and things are just on the up and up, you know? You know? But it's the same author that wrote Killers of the Flower Moon, and I'm enjoying it so far. There are like excerpts from letters that the crew has written, and as well as like biographies and things like that. But a lot of things came from this journey, like a lot of sayings, and also like, oh, should we clean our medical tools? Hmm, no. So I am enjoying it so far. And there's pictures in it too, which I haven't gotten to the pictures yet, and I must not spoil myself. Um, what else? What else? I am listening to Keenan Thompson's autobiography. I forgot what it's called. I think it's called like When I Was Your Age or something like that. I am it's okay. I was gonna say I'm enjoying it, but like, am I? That's rude. That's mean. That was much meaner than what I meant to say. It's okay. He talks about his time growing up, always wanting to be an actor, always wanting to be a comedian in his own right, and the time that he spent on all that and the Keenan and Kel show and SNL, and the different guides that he has had, like Arsenio Hall and Steve Martin. No, not Steve Martin. What's his name? That's embarrassing. Harvey, Steve Harvey. What am I saying? Um, and yeah, so it is interesting, and he does say that women are funny in it, and a couple times, and it's like, yeah, yeah, they are. So it's pretty good. I'm almost done with it, and he reads it, and I think that might be like the best part of it, just because I think that he is so good at emphasizing the right words in order to like, I don't know, put excitement or joy or emphasis, for lack of a better term, on things. So it's good. I have like 10 minutes left. I should have just finished it, but I didn't. Maybe I'll finish it today. And then I picked up, so our Patreon buddy read. If you didn't know, I do have a Patreon, and we do buddy reads every once in a while. And our October Patreon buddy read is If We Were Villains by ML Rio. And I just picked it up, and look how pretty. Look how pretty. Doesn't that make you want to read it? I just picked it up. I have not read it. I'm not going to start reading it until we do our we're going to have an extra reading sprint at the end of the month. And that's when I'll start this. And also when the discussion is going to be opened up on Discord. But I think that's all that I am reading, I think. So that's not why we're here today. We are here because we love Anna Karenina. So today we are starting part 3, chapter 18, and what happened last time? Well, great question. We had, well, Kitty is now in the country. with hanging out with Daria, and Levin saw her. And that's when we like left Levin. Levin had been like, woe is me type of a thing. He went to go hang out with Daria and got the lowdown that Kitty is going to be coming here. And just because she said no to his proposal before, it just meant no in that minute rather than no, not ever. Because she was banking on getting a proposal by somebody else. Like she didn't see the full picture of what she was saying no to. And Levin is like, don't you dare, blah, blah, blah. I'm gonna go and marry a peasant and have a simple life. And then as soon as he sees her in the, like, carriage, it, like, that idea is just completely wiped from his brain. He's like, I love this woman. And that's where we left Levin. And then we floodled on over to, back to Anna and her husband. If everybody just didn't have such long names, it might be easier to remember. And her husband dropped her off and the next day wrote a letter to Anna, basically deciding that he cannot do a duel for her because he might be injured. He cannot file for a divorce because then Anna can just go be with Vronsky and be happy. And he cannot separate because the same thing. Anna can just go and be with Vronsky. So he's decided on this fourth option, which is they will stay together and Anna will stop being around Vronsky. And so he writes the letter saying all of this, sends it off to Anna. While this is happening, Anna wakes up just so excited and then not excited, realizing what she had said. She told her husband that she can only ever think of Vronsky and she hates him and she just wants to be with Vronsky and ride off into the sunset. And so now she's realizing, like, what have I done? I wish I could take it all back. And she writes a letter to him basically saying, like, I'm running away with our son. Sends that off. Before Anna actually runs away, though, in comes the letter that her hubbies sent over, and so she reads it, and she did get what she wanted in that it seems like he is wiping the slate clean. Like what she said doesn't matter, and that's what she wanted. And then she realizes, like, wait, this isn't what I want, because we're just going to go back to the old way of living, except it's going to be worse than the old way of living because now we'll have this hanging over us. And I didn't even like the old way of living. And so, like, her coming to terms with that, and she's like, stop packing, but don't unpack until tomorrow. I need to scurry about. So she scurries about over to Betsy's house, Princess Betsy. And she is expecting Vronsky to be there and then remembers that Vronsky said that he wasn't going to be there. Vronsky sends a letter to Betsy saying, I'm not going to be there. Betsy's like, I have something else to do in the other room. And so she goes out of the room and she's like, Anna, please, like, fold up my letter for me. And so Anna, in the note, responding to Vronsky, is like, hey, meet me at 6 p.m., folds it up, and then Betsy comes back and gives it to the courier. Um, mm, 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 mm. Betsy and Anna also talk about this other couple that is kind of knowingly, like, this other couple, like, she is kind of, like, seeing somebody else, but the husband is very understanding of it, in that, like, they still in society are like married and go out in public and all of these things. And it's, what did she compare it to? Something about like how we all know what's in the toilet, but we don't really talk about it. And I think that might be where we ended. Oh yes, and Betsy was also like, you only see the bad things. You only see the bad things. You never see like the silver lining side of things. And that's where we ended. Chapter 18. They heard the sounds of steps and a man's voice, then a woman's voice and laughter, and immediately thereafter there walked in the expected guests, Sappho Stolz and a young man, beaming with excess of health. The soul called Vaska. It was evident that ample supplies of beefsteak, truffles, and burgundy never failed to reach him at the fitting hour. Vaska bowed to the two ladies and glanced at them, but only for 1 second. He walked after Sappho into the drawing-room and followed her about as though he were chained to her, keeping his sparkling eyes fixed on her as though he wanted to eat her. Sappho Stolz was a blonde beauty with black eyes. She walked with smart little steps in high-heeled shoes and shook hands with the ladies vigorously, like a man. Anna had never met this new star of fashion and was struck by her beauty. The exaggerated extreme to which her dress was carried, and the boldness of her manners. On her head there was such a superstructure of soft, golden hair, her own and false mixed, that her head was equal in size to the elegantly rounded bust of which so much was exposed in front. The impulsive abruptness of her movements was such that at every step the lines of her knees and the upper part of her legs were distinctly marked under her dress, and the question involuntarily rose to the mind where in the undulating, piled-up mountain of material at the back the real body of the woman, so small and slender, so naked in front, and so hidden behind and below, really came to an end. Betsy made haste to introduce her to Anna. "Oh, only fancy, but we all but ran over 2 soldiers," she began telling them at once, using her eyes, smiling and twitching away her tail, which she flung back at one stroke on one side. "I drove here with Vaska. Ah, to be sure, you don't know each other." And mentioning his surname, she introduced the young man, the reddening a little, broke into a ringing laugh at her mistake, that is, at her having called him Vaska to a stranger. Vaska bowed once more to Anna, but he said nothing to her. He addressed Sappho. "You've lost your bet. We got here first. Pay up," said he, smiling. Sappho smiled, still more festively. "Not just now," said she. "All right, I'll have it later." "Very well, very well. Oh, yes." She turned suddenly to Princess Betsy. "I am a nice person. I positively forgot it. I've brought you a visitor, and here he comes." The unexpected young visitor whom Sappho had invited, and whom she had forgotten, was, however, a personage of such consequence that, in spite of his youth, both the ladies rose on his entrance. He was a new admirer of Sappho's. He now dogged her footsteps like Vaska. Soon after Prince Kolosky arrived, and Liza Merkelova and Stremov. Liza Merkelova was a thin brunette with an oriental, languid type of face, and, as everyone used to say, exquisite and enigmatic eyes. The tone of her dark dress, Anna immediately observed and appreciated the fact, was in perfect harmony with her style of beauty. Liza was as soft and enervated as Sappho was smart and abrupt. But to Anna's taste, Liza was far more attractive. Betsy had said to Anna that she had adopted the pose of an innocent child, but when Anna saw her, she felt that this was not the truth. She really was both innocent and corrupt, but a sweet and passive woman. It is true that her tone was the same as Sappho's, that, like Sappho, she had 2 men, one young and one old, tacked into her, and devouring her with their eyes. But there was something in her higher than what surrounded her. There was in her the glow of the real diamond among glass imitations. This glow shone out in her exquisite, truly enigmatic eyes. The weary and, at the same time, passionate glance of those eyes encircled by dark rings, impressed one by its perfect sincerity. Everyone looking into those eyes fancied he knew her wholly, and knowing her, could not but love her. At the sight of Anna, her whole face lighted up at once with a smile of delight. "Oh, how glad I am to see you," she said, going up to her. "Yesterday, at the races, all I wanted was to get to you, but you'd gone away. I did so want to see you, yesterday, especially. Wasn't it awful?" she said, looking at Anna with the eyes that seemed to lay bare all her soul. "Yes, I had no idea it would be so thrilling," said Anna, blushing. The company got up at this moment to go into the garden. "Oh, I'm not going," said Liza, smiling and settling herself close to Anna. "You won't go either, will you? Who wants to play croquet?" "Oh, I like it," said Anna. "There, how do you manage never to be bored by things? It's delightful to look at. You're alive, but I'm bored." "How can you be bored? Why, you live in the liveliest set in Petersburg," said Anna. "Possibly the people who are not of our set are even more bored, but I certainly, are not happy, but awfully, awfully bored." Sappho smoking a cigarette, went off into the garden with the two young men. Betsy and Stremov remained at the tea table. "What? Bored?" said Betsy. "Sappho says they did enjoy themselves tremendously at your house last night." "Huh, how dreary it all was," said Liza Merkulova. "We all drove back to my place after the races, and always the same people, always the same thing. We lounged about on sofas all the evening. What is there to enjoy in that? No, do tell me how you manage never to be bored," she said, addressing Anna again. "One has but to look at you and one sees. Here's a woman who may be happy or unhappy, but isn't bored. Tell me, how do you do it?" "I do nothing," answered Anna, blushing at these searching questions. "That's the best way," Stremov put in. Stremov was a man of 50, partly gray, but still vigorous-looking, very ugly, but with a characteristic and intelligent face. Liza Merkulova was his wife's niece, and he spent all his leisure hours with her. On meeting Anna Karenina as he was Alexei Alexandrovitch's enemy in the government, he tried, like a shrewd man and a man of the world, to be particularly cordial with her, the wife of his enemy. "Nothing," he put in with a subtle smile. "That's the very best way. I told you long ago," he said, turning to Liza Merkulova, "that if you don't want to be bored, you mustn't think you're going to be bored. It's just as you mustn't be afraid of not being able to fall asleep, if you're afraid of sleeplessness. That's just what Anna Arkadyevna has just said." I should be very glad if I had said that, for it's not only clever, but true," said Anna, smiling. "No, do tell me why it is one can't go to sleep, and one can't help being bored." "To sleep well, one ought to work, and to enjoy oneself one ought to work too." "What am I to work for when my work is of no use to anybody, and I can't and won't knowingly make a pretense about it?" "You are incorrigible," said Stremov, not looking at her, and he spoke again to Anna. As he rarely met Anna, he could say nothing but commonplaces to her. But he said those commonplaces as to when she was returning to Petersburg, and how fond Countess Lydia Ivanovna was of her, with an expression which suggested that he longed with his whole soul to please her and show his regard for her, and even more than that. Tushkevich came in, announcing that the party was awaiting the other players to begin croquet. "No, Don't go away, please don't, pleaded Liza Merkulova, hearing that Anna was going. Stremov joined in her entreaties. It's too violent a transition, he said, to go from such company to old Madame Verde. And besides, you will only give her a chance for talking scandal, while here you arouse none but such different feelings of the highest and most opposite kind, he said to her. Anna pondered for an instant in uncertainty. This shrewd man's flattering words, the naive, childlike affection shown her by Liza Merkulova, and all the social atmosphere she was used to. It was all so easy. And what was in store for her was so difficult, that she was for a minute in uncertainty whether to remain, whether to put off a little longer the painful moment of explanation. But remembering what was in store for her alone at home, if she did not come to some decision, remembering that gesture, terrible even in memory, when she had clutched her hair in both hands, she said goodbye and went away. End of chapter 18. All right, so we actually meet some people that we have heard of before. Can't remember their names. We met Stremov, we met Liza Merkulova, and somebody else. Two somebody elses. But they're there and they are bored. They're rich and they're bored. And how can anybody find any joy in anything anymore? How can, you find joy in doing croquet, in playing croquet? How I look at you, Anna, and you look to be either happy or unhappy, but definitely not bored. What is your secret? And Anna's like, oh, I don't know. And that's basically it. And Anna's like, I don't want to be here right now. So she was trying to get up when they were like coming in to get more players for croquet, and both Stremov and Liza Merkulova were like, no, no, please stay here. Please, please. You'll only hear gossip from Madame Verde, and we are the complete opposite of that. And she's like, Chapter 19. In spite of Vronsky's apparently frivolous life in society, he was a man who hated irregularity. In early youth, in the Corps of Pages, he had experienced the humiliation of a refusal, when he had tried, being in difficulties, to borrow money, and since then he had never once put himself in the same position again. In order to keep his affairs in some sort of order, he used about 5 times a year, more or less frequently, according to circumstances, to shut himself up alone and put all his affairs into definite shape. This he used to call his day of reckoning, or faire la lisse. On waking up the day after the races, Vronsky put on a white linen coat, and without shaving or taking his bath, he distributed about the table moneys, bills, and letters, and set to work. Petritsky, who knew he was ill-tempered on such occasions, on waking up and seeing his comrade at the writing table, quietly dressed and went out without getting in his way. Every man who knows to the minutest details all the complexity of the conditions surrounding him cannot help imagining that the complexity of these conditions and the difficulty of making them clear is something exceptional and personal, peculiar to himself, and never supposes that others are surrounded by just as complicated an array of personal affairs as he is. So indeed it seemed to Vronsky, and not without inward pride, and not without reason, he thought that any other man would long ago have been in difficulties, would have been forced to some dishonorable course, if he had found himself in such a difficult position. But Vronsky felt that now especially it was essential for him to clear up and define his position if he were to avoid getting into difficulties. What Vronsky attacked first as being the easiest was his pecuniary position. Writing out on notepaper in his minute hand all that he owed, he added up the amount and found that his debts amounted to 17,000 and some odd hundreds, which he left out for the sake of clearness. Reckoning up his money and his bank book, he found that he had left 1,800 rubles and nothing coming in before the new year. Reckoning over again his list of debts, Vronsky copied it, dividing it into 3 classes. In the first class, he put the debts which he would have to pay at once, or for which he must in any case have the money ready so that on demand for payment there could not be a moment's delay in paying. Such debts amounted to about 4,000, 1,500 for a horse, and 2,500 as surety for a young comrade, Vinovsky, who had lost that sum to a card sharper in Vronsky's presence. Vronsky had wanted to pay the money at the time. He had that amount then. But Vinovsky and Yashvin had insisted that they would pay, and not Vronsky, who had not paid. That was so far well, but Vronsky knew that in this dirty business, though his only share in it was undertaking by word of mouth to be surety of Vinovsky, it was absolutely necessary for him to have the 2,500 rubles so as to be able to fling it at the swindler and have no more words with him. And so, for this first and most important division, he must have 4,000 rubles. The second class, 8,000 rubles, consisted of less important debts. These were principally accounts owing in connection with his racehorses, to the purveyor of oats and hay, the English saddler, and so on. He would have to pay some 2,000 rubles on these debts too, in order to be quite free from anxiety. The last class of debts, to shops, to hotels, to his tailor, were such as need not be considered, so that he needed at least 6,000 rubles for current expenses, and he only had 1,800. For a man with 100,000 rubles of revenue, which was what everyone fixed as Vronsky's income, such debts, one would suppose, could hardly be embarrassing. But the fact was that he was far from having 100,000. His father's immense property, which alone yielded a yearly income of 200,000, was left undivided between the brothers. At the time when the elder brother, with a mass of debts, married Princess Varya Cheskova, the daughter of a Decembrist, without any fortune whatever, Alexei had given up to his elder brother almost the whole income from his father's estate, reserving for himself only 25,000 a year from it. Alexei had said at the time to his brother that that sum would be sufficient for him until he married, which he probably never would do. And his brother, who was in command of one of the most expensive regiments, and was only just married, could not decline the gift. His mother, who had her own separate property, had allowed Alexei every year 20,000 in addition to the 25,000 he had reserved, and Alexei had spent it all. Of late, his mother, incensed with him on account of his love affair and his leaving Moscow, had given up sending him the money. And in consequence of this, Vronsky, who had been in the habit of living on the scale of 45,000 a year, having only received 20,000 that year, found himself now in difficulties. To get out of these difficulties, he could not apply to his mother for money. Her last letter, which he had received the day before, had particularly exasperated him by the hints in it that she was quite ready to help him to succeed in the world and in the army, but not to lead a life which was a scandal to all good society. His mother's attempt to buy him stung him to the quick and made him feel colder than ever to her. But he could not draw back from the generous word when it was once uttered, even though he felt now, vaguely foreseeing certain eventualities in his intrigue with Madame Karenina, that this generous word had been spoken thoughtlessly, and that even though he were not married, he might need all the 100,000 of income. But it was impossible to draw back. He had only to recall his brother's wife, to remember how that sweet, delightful Varia sought, at every convenient opportunity, to remind him that she remembered his generosity and appreciated it, to grasp the impossibility of taking back his gift. It was as impossible as beating a woman, stealing, or lying. One thing only could and ought to be done, and Vronsky determined upon it without an instant's hesitation: to borrow money from a moneylender, 10,000 roubles, a proceeding which presented no difficulty, to cut down his expenses generally, and to sell his racehorse. Resolving on this, he promptly wrote a note to Rolandak, who had more than once sent to him with offers to buy horses from him. Then he sent for the Englishman and the moneylender, and divided what money he had according to the accounts he intended to pay. Having finished this business, he wrote a cold and cutting answer to his mother. Then he took out his notebook, 3 notes of Anna's, read them again, burned them, and remembering their conversation on the previous day, he sank into meditation. End of chapter 19. Okay. Vronsky's not doing so hot financially. This whole chapter was about him being in debt. And he has 3 classes that he has divided into: debts that he needs to pay immediately, debts that can wait a little bit, and then those other debts. And they talk about the income that he supposedly has, but there's an explanation for it, of course. And he can't really ask his mom, even though his mom is so happy to help him in life and help him advance in the army, but not lead a life of scandal. So because of his life of scandal with Anna, she's like, I will only help you if you stop that nonsense. And so he's not going to write to her. So he's going to sell some of his racehorses and be able to pay off some of his debt. But it is interesting. Also, there's mention of like when his dad passed, the land was given to him and his 2 brothers, but it wasn't divided. So it's not like, this is the portion you get, this is the portion you get, nothing like that. And Vronsky just decided that, like, his brother, who was getting married at the time, should have, like, most of it, because more people, that type of thing. And Vronsky's like, we'll talk about it again when I get married, which may or may not ever happen. So, also interesting that he had 3 letters of Anna's, took them out, reread them, and then burned them. Mm, mm. All right. Chapter 20. Vronsky's life was particularly happy in that he had a code of principles, which defined with unfailing certitude what he ought and what he ought not to do. This code of principles covered only a very small circle of contingencies, but then the principles were never doubtful, and Vronsky, as he never went outside that circle, had never had a moment's hesitation about doing what he ought to do. These principles laid down as invariable rules: that one must pay a card sharper, but need not pay a tailor; that one must never tell a lie to a man, but one may to a woman; that one must never cheat anyone, but one may a husband. That one must never pardon an insult, but one may give one, and so on. These principles were possibly not reasonable and not good, but they were of unfailing certainty, and so long as he adhered to them, Vronsky felt that his heart was at peace, and he could hold his head up. Only quite lately, in regard to his relations with Anna, Vronsky had begun to feel that his code of principles did not fully cover all possible contingencies, and to foresee in the future difficulties and perplexities for which he could find no guiding clue. His present relation to Anna and to her husband was to his mind clear and simple. It was clearly and precisely defined in the code of principles by which he was guided. She was an honorable woman who had bestowed her love upon him, and he loved her, and therefore she was in his eyes a woman who had a right to the same, and even more, respect than a lawful wife. He would have had his hand chopped off before he would have allowed himself, by a word, by a hint, to humiliate her, or even to fall short of the fullest respect a woman could look for. His attitude to society, too, was clear. Everyone might know, might suspect it, but no one might dare to speak of it. If anyone did so, he was ready to force all who might speak to be silent, and to respect the non-existent honor of the woman he loved. His attitude to the husband was the clearest of all. From the moment that Anna loved Vronsky, he had regarded his own right over her as the one thing unassailable. Her husband was simply a superfluous and tiresome person. No doubt he was in a pitiable position, but how could that be helped? One thing the husband had a right to was to demand satisfaction with a weapon in his hand, and Vronsky was prepared for this at any moment. But of late, new interrelations had arisen between him and her, which frightened Vronsky by their indefiniteness. Only the day before she had told him that she was with child, and he felt that this fact and what she expected of him called for something not fully defined in that code of principles by which he had hitherto steered his course in life. But he had been indeed caught unawares, and at the first moment when she spoke to him of her position, his heart had prompted him to beg her to leave her husband. He had said that. But now, thinking things over, he saw clearly that it would be better to manage to avoid that, and at the same time, as he told himself so, he was afraid whether it was not wrong. If I told her to leave her husband, that must mean untying her life with mine. Am I prepared for that? How can I take her away now, when I have no money, supposing I could arrange? But how can I take her away while I'm in the service? If I stay, that I ought to be prepared to do it, that is, I ought to have the money and to retire from the army. And he grew thoughtful. The question whether to retire from the service or not brought him to the other and perhaps the chief, though hidden interest of his life, of which none knew but he. Ambition was the old dream of his youth and childhood, a dream which he did not confess even to himself, though it was so strong that now his passion was even doing battle with his love. His first steps in the world and in the service had been successful, but 2 years before he had made a great mistake, anxious to show his independence and to advance. He had refused a post that had been offered him, hoping that this refusal would heighten his value. But it turned out that he had been too bold, and he would be passed over. And having, whether he liked it or not, taken up for himself the position of an independent man, he carried it off with great tact and good sense, behaving as though he bore no grudge against anyone, did not regard himself as injured in any way, and cared for nothing but to be left alone since he was enjoying himself. In reality, he had ceased to enjoy himself as long ago as the year before, when he went away to Moscow. He felt that this independent attitude of a man who might have done anything but cared to do nothing was already beginning to pall, that many people were beginning to fancy that he was not really capable of anything but being a straightforward, good-natured fellow. His connection with Madame Karenina, by creating so much sensation and attracting general attention, had given him a fresh distinction, which soothed his gnawing worm of ambition for a while. But a week before that worm had been roused up again with fresh force. The friend of his childhood, a man of the same set, of the same coterie, his comrade in the corps of pages, Serpuhovskoy, who had left school with him and had been his rival in class, in gymnastics, in their scrapes and their dreams of glory, had come back a few days before from Central Asia, where he had gained 2 steps in rank and in order rarely bestowed upon generals so young. As soon as he arrived in Petersburg, people began to talk about him as a newly risen star for the first magnitude. A schoolfellow of Vronsky's and of the same age, he was a general, and was expecting a command which might have influence on the course of political events, while Vronsky, independent and brilliant and beloved by a charming woman though he was simply a cavalry captain who was readily allowed to be as independent as ever he liked. Of course, I don't envy Serpuhovskoy, and never could envy him, but his advancement shows me that one has only to watch one's opportunity, and the career of a man like me may be very rapidly made. 3 years ago he was in just the same position as I am. If I retire, I burn my ships. If I remain in the army, I lose nothing. She said herself she did not wish to change her position, and with her love I cannot feel envious of Serpuhovskoy. And slowly twirling his mustache, he got up from the table and walked about the room. His eyes shone particularly brightly, and he felt in that confident, calm, and happy frame of mind which always came after he had thoroughly faced his position. Everything was straight and clear, just as after former days of reckoning. He shaved, took a cold bath, dressed, and went out. End of chapter 20. Chapter 20. We have some, not necessarily regret, but yes, the real life is coming in. Chapter 19, we know that Vronsky is not as financially stable as we thought. He's not as well off as we thought. He has a bunch of debt that he is not really able to pay off right now. And chapter 20 is him trying to figure out what the next step is. He's like, well, her husband could definitely come at me with a pistol, and I guess I would be ready. And I think that that is a great parallel to when we had his chapter, Alexei Alexandrovich, there we go, when we had his chapter and he was talking about the option of duel, and he's like, well, I don't really want to do that because I might be injured. So I think that that's funny that they are kind of going through the same conversation almost. I mean, different on the different side of the conversation, but still like the same ideas are there. And Vronsky is like, okay, well, I could just retire from the army, I guess. But where would that leave me? And he's talking about other people that he knows, like friends of his or people the same age and where they are now and how they have advanced and he hasn't advanced for certain reasons. He's been bypassed, he said no so that he could stay in Moscow, like whatever the reason is, he is at the same level as his comrades were 3 years ago. But he's looking at it as like a positive thing. He's like, so I could advance, like if I focused on my career, like my job. And Anna herself even said that she doesn't want to change her position. So it doesn't really matter that like how much she like wants to be with me. She's not going to leave. Like nothing is going to change. So what does that mean for me? Interesting. Interesting. It's almost like it's deliberate. Mustache twirling. What a villain. I know. It's villain coded for sure. And it's also interesting that, like, if he is not with Anna, like, his mom would help him out. Whether or not he actually wants the help after that is a completely different factor, but she would help. She would help. Chapter 21. We've come to fetch you. Your lessive lasted a good time today, said Petritsky. Well, is it over? It is over, answered Vronsky, smiling with his eyes only and twirling the tips of his mustaches as circumspectively as though after the perfect order into which his affairs had been brought any overbold or rapid movement might disturb it. You're always just as if you'd come out of a bath after it, said Petritsky. I've come from Gritsky's. That was what they called the colonel. They're expecting you. Vronsky, without answering, looked at his comrade, thinking of something else. Yes. Is that music at his place? He said, listening to the familiar sounds of polkas and waltzes floating across him. What's the fete? Superholfskoy's coming. Ah, said Vronsky. Why, I didn't know. The smile in his eyes gleamed more brightly than ever. Having once made up his mind that he was happy in his love, that he sacrificed his ambition to it, having anyway taken up his position, Vronsky was incapable of feeling either envious of Superholfskoy or hurt with him for not coming first to him when he came to the regiment. Superholfskoy was a good friend, and he was delighted he had come. Ah, I'm very glad. The colonel, Demmin, had taken a large country house. The whole party were in the wide lower balcony. In the courtyard, the first objects that met Vronsky's eyes were a band of singers in white linen coats, standing near a barrel of vodka, and the robust, good-humored figure of the colonel surrounded by officers. He had gone out as far as the first step of the balcony, and was loudly shouting across the band that played Offenbach's quadrille, having his arms and giving some orders to a few soldiers standing on one side. A group of soldiers, a quartermaster, and several subalterns came up to the balcony with Vronsky. The colonel returned to the table, went out again onto the steps with a tumbler in his hand, and proposed the toast. To the health of our former comrade, the gallant general, Prince Superholfskoy. Hurrah! The colonel was followed by Superholfskoy, who came out onto the steps smiling, and with a glass in his hand. You always get younger, Bondarenko, he said to the rosy-cheeked, smart-looking quartermaster standing just before him, still youngish-looking, though doing his second term of service. It was 3 years since Vronsky had seen Superholfskoy. He looked more robust, had let his whiskers grow, but was still the same graceful creature, whose face and figure were even more striking from their softness and nobility than their beauty. The only change Vronsky detected in him was that subdued, continual radiance of beaming content which settles on the faces of men who are successful and are sure of the recognition of their success by everyone. Vronsky knew that radiant air, and immediately observed it in Superholfskoy. As Superholfskoy came down the steps, he saw Vronsky. A smile of pleasure lighted up his face. He tossed his head upwards and waved the glass in his hand, greeting Vronsky, and showing him by the gesture that he could not come to him before the quartermaster, who stood craning forward, his lips ready to be kissed. There he is, shouted the colonel, Yashvin told me you were in one of your gloomy tempers. Zapohovskoy kissed the moist, fresh lips of the gallant-looking quartermaster, and wiping his mouth with his handkerchief, went up to Vronsky. "How glad I am," he said, squeezing his hand and drawing him on one side. "You look after him," the colonel shouted at Yashvin, pointing to Vronsky, and he went down below to the soldiers. "Why weren't you at the races yesterday? I expected to see you there," said Vronsky, scrutinizing Zapohovskoy. "I did go, but late. I beg your pardon," he added, and turned to the adjutant. "Please have this divided from me, each man as much as it runs to." And he hurriedly took notes for 300 rubles from his pocketbook, blushing a little. "Vronsky, have anything to eat or drink?" asked Yashvin. "Hi, something for the count to eat. Ah, here it is. Have a glass." The fete at the colonel's lasted a long while. There was a great deal of drinking. They tossed Supohovskoy in the air and caught him again several times. Then they did the same to the colonel. Then, to the accompaniment of the band, the colonel himself danced with Petritsky. Then the colonel, who began to show signs of feebleness, sat down on a bench in the courtyard and began demonstrating to Yashvin the superiority of Russia over Prussia, especially in cavalry attack, and there was a lull in the reverie for a moment. Serpuhovskoy went into the house to the bathroom to wash his hands and found Vronsky there. Vronsky was drenching his head with water. He had taken off his coat and put his sunburnt, hairy neck under the tap and was rubbing it with his head, and his head with his hands. When he had finished, Vronsky sat down by Serpuhovskoy. They both sat down in the bathroom on a lounge, and a conversation began which was very interesting to both of them. "I've always been hearing about you through your wife," said Serpuhovskoy. "I'm glad you've been seeing her pretty often." "She's friendly with Varya, and they're the only women in Petersburg I care about seeing," answered Vronsky, smiling. He smiled because he foresaw the topic the conversation would turn on, and he was glad of it. "The only ones?" Serpuhovskoy queried, smiling. "Yes, I heard news of you, but not only through your wife," said Vronsky, checking his hint by a stern expression of face. "I was greatly delighted to hear of your success, but not a bit surprised. I expected even more." Serpuhovskoy smiled. Such an opinion of him was obviously agreeable to him, and he did not think it necessary to conceal it. "Well, I, on the contrary, expected less. I'll own frankly. But I'm glad. Very glad. I'm ambitious. That's my weakness, and I confess to it." "Perhaps you wouldn't confess to it if you hadn't been successful," said Vronsky. "I don't suppose so," said Serpuhovskoy, smiling again. "I won't say life wouldn't be worth living without it, but it would be dull. Of course, I may be mistaken, but I fancy I have a certain capacity for the line I've chosen, and that power of any sort in my hands, if it is to be, will be better than in the hands of a good many people I know," said Serpuhovskoy, with beaming consciousness of success. "And so the nearer I get to it, the better pleased I am." "Perhaps that is true for you, but not for everyone. I used to think so too, but here I live and think life worth living not only for that." "There it is. Here it comes," said Serpuhovskoy, laughing. "Ever since I heard about you, about your refusal, I began... Of course, I approved of what you did, but there are ways of doing everything, and I think your action was good in itself, but you didn't do it quite in the way you ought to have done. What's done can't be undone, and you know I never go back on what I've done, and besides, I'm very well off." "Very well off?" "For the time. But you're not satisfied with that. I wouldn't say this to your brother. He's a nice child, like our host here. Oh, there he goes," he added, listening to the roar of hurrah. "And he's happy, but that does not satisfy you." I didn't say it did satisfy me. Yes, but that's not the only thing. Such men as you are wanted. By whom? By whom? By society, by Russia. Russia needs men. She needs a party, or else everything goes and will go to the dogs. How do you mean? Bertenev's party against the Russian communists? No, said Sapolskoy, frowning with vexation at being suspected of such an absurdity. That's always been, and always will be. There are no communists, but intriguing people have to invent a noxious, dangerous party. It's an old trick. No, what's wanted is a powerful party of independent men like you and me. But why so? Vronsky mentioned a few men who were in power. Why aren't they independent men? Simply because they have not, or have not had from birth, an independent fortune. They've not had a name. They've not been close to the sun and center as we have. They can be bought either by money or by favor, and they have to find a support for themselves in inventing a policy. And they bring forward some notion, some policy that they don't believe in, that does harm. And the whole policy is really only a means to a government house and so much income. Cela n'est pas plus fin que ça. When you get a peep at their cards, I may be inferior to them, stupider perhaps, though I don't see why I should be inferior to them. But you and I have one important advantage over them for certain, in being more difficult to buy. And such men are more needed than ever. Vronsky listened attentively, but he was not so much interested by the meaning of the words as by the attitude of Serpuhovskoy, who was already contemplating a struggle with the existing powers, and already had his likes and dislikes in that higher world, while his own interest in the governing world did not go beyond the interest of his regiment. Vronsky, too, felt how powerful Serpuhovskoy might become through his unmistakable faculty for thinking things out and for taking things in, through his intelligence and gift of words, so rarely met with in the world in which he moved, and, ashamed as he was of the feeling, he felt envious. Still, I haven't the one thing of most importance for that, he answered. I haven't the desire for power. I had it once, but it's gone. Excuse me, that's not true, said Serpuhovskoy, smiling. Yes, it is. It is true. Now, Vronsky added, to be truthful. Yes, it's true, now. That's another thing, but that now won't last forever. Perhaps, answered Vronsky. You say perhaps, Serpuhovskoy went on, as though guessing his thoughts, but I say for certain, and that's what I wanted to see you for. Your action was just what it should have been. I see that, but you ought not to keep it up. I only ask you to give me carte blanche. I'm not going to offer you my protection, though, indeed, why shouldn't I protect you? You've protected me often enough. I should hope our friendship rises above all that sort of thing. Yes, he said, smiling to him as tenderly as a woman. Give me carte blanche. Retire from the regiment, and I'll draw you upwards imperceptibly. But you must understand that I want nothing, said Vronsky, except that all should be as it is. Serpuhovskoy got up and stood facing him. You say that all should be as it is. I understand what that means. But listen, we're the same age. You've known a greater number of women perhaps than I have. Serpuhovskoy's smile and gestures told Vronsky that he mustn't be afraid, that he would be tender and careful in touching the sore place. But I'm married, and believe me, in getting to know thoroughly one's wife, if one loves her, as someone has said, one gets to know all women better than if one knew thousands of them. "We're coming directly," Vronsky heard, shouted to an officer, who looked into the room and called them to the colonel. Vronsky was longing now to hear to the end, and know that Serpuhovskoy would say to him, "And here's my opinion for you. Women are the chief stumbling block in a man's career. It's hard to love a woman and do anything. There's only one way of having love conveniently without its being a hindrance. That's marriage. How am I to tell you what I mean?" said Serpuhovskoy, who liked similes. Wait a minute, yes. Just as you can only carry a fardeau and do something with your hands. When the fardeau is tied on your back, and that's marriage. And that's what I felt when I was married. My hands were suddenly set free. But to drag that fardeau about with you without marriage, your hands will always be so full that you can do nothing. Look at Mezankov, at Krapov. They've ruined their careers for the sake of women. What women? Said Vronsky, recalling the Frenchwoman and the actress with whom the two men he had mentioned were connected. The firmer the woman's footing in society, the worse it is. That's much the same as not merely carrying the fardeau in your arms, but tearing it away from someone else. You have never loved, Vronsky said softly, looking straight before him and thinking of Anna. Perhaps. But you remember what I've said to you. And another thing. Women are all more materialistic than men. We make something immense out of love, but they are always terre-à-terre. Directly, he cried to a footman who came in. But the footman had not come to call them again, as he supposed. The footman brought Vronsky a note. A man brought it from Princess Tverskaya. Vronsky opened the letter and flushed crimson. My head's begun to ache. I'm going home, he said to Serpuhovskoy. Oh, goodbye then. You give me carte blanche? We'll talk about it later on. I'll look you up in Petersburg. End of chapter 21. Okay, chapter 21. Vronsky, okay, so in chapter 20, Vronsky is thinking about his future. He mentioned Serpuhovskoy, and that they started at the same time, they're the same age, yada yada yada. And now Vronsky is at a party because Serpuhovskoy has returned from wherever he was for work. He's returned, they're having a party, they're chatting, they're having a good time, and Vronsky is still reflecting on the different positions, his position in particular, how it's different than others, but also, like, what he should do with the Anna situation. Like, should he still be with her? Should he, like, ask her continually to run away with him? All of these things, and what that means for his career. And Serpuhovskoy is on an outsider's perspective. He is married. He's higher ranked than Vronsky, all of these things. And so he's giving opinions about what it is like to have, you know, to be married and to have like a stable relationship with one person, and how different it is to not be tied down and to have like a bunch of like women and like lovers and interests, and how that is a distraction rather than being married. And there's some chatter. But at the end of that, Vronsky receives the note, which we know from last time that it is the note that Betsy wrote, and Anna signed it at the end saying, like, meet me at this place at this time. So now Vronsky is like, oh, my head hurts. I have to go home. So then he leaves. And that's where we are. Okay. Chapter 22. It was 6 o'clock already, and so, in order to be there quickly and at the same time not to drive with his own horses, known to everyone, Vronsky got into Yashvin's hired fly and told the driver to drive as quickly as possible. It was a roomy, old-fashioned fly with seats for four. He sat in one corner, stretched his legs out on the front seat, and sank into meditation. A vague sense of the order into which his affairs had been brought, a vague recollection of the friendliness and the flattery of Serpuhovskoy, who had considered him a man that was needed, and most of all, the anticipation of the interview before him, all blended into a general, joyous sense of life. This feeling was so strong that he could not help smiling. He dropped his legs, crossed one leg over the other knee, and taking it in his hand, felt the springy muscle of the calf, where it had been grazed the day before by his fall, and leaning back, he drew several deep breaths. "I'm happy, very happy," he said to himself. He had often before had this sense of physical joy in his own body, but he had never felt so fond of himself, of his own body, as at that moment. He enjoyed the slight ache in his strong leg. He enjoyed the muscular sensation of the movement in his chest as he breathed. The bright, cold August day, which had made Anna feel so hopeless, seemed to him keenly stimulating, and refreshed his face and neck that still tingled from the cold water. The scent of brilliantine on his whiskers struck him as particularly pleasant in the fresh air. Everything he saw from the carriage window, everything in that cold, pure air, in the pale light of the sunset, was as fresh and happy and strong as he was himself. The roofs of the houses shining in the rays of the setting sun, the sharp outlines of fences and angles of buildings, the figures of passers-by, the carriages that met him now and then, the motionless green of the trees and grass, the fields with evenly drawn furrows of potatoes, and the slanting shadows that fell from the houses, and trees, and bushes, and even from the rows of potatoes, everything was bright, like a pretty landscape just finished and freshly varnished. Get on," he said to the driver, putting his head out of the window, and pulling a 3-ruble note out of his pocket, he handed it to the man as he looked round. The driver's hand fumbled with something at the lamp, the whip cracked, and the carriage rolled rapidly along the smooth high road. "I want nothing but this happiness," he thought, staring at the bone button of the bell in the space between the windows, and picturing himself Anna just as he had seen her last time. "And as I go on, I love her more and more. Here's the garden of the Verdre Villa. Whereabouts will she be? Where? How? Why did she fix on this place to meet me, and why does she write in Betsy's letter?" he thought, wondering now for the first time at it. But there was now no time to wonder. He called to the driver to stop before reaching the avenue, and opening the door, jumped out of the carriage as it was moving, and went into the avenue that led up to the house. There was no one in the avenue, but looking round to the right he caught sight of her. Her face was hidden by a veil, but he drank in with glad eyes the special movement in walking, peculiar to her alone, the slope of the shoulders and setting of the head, and at once a sort of electric shock ran all over him. With fresh force he felt conscious of himself, from the springy motions of his legs to the movements of his lungs as he breathed, and something set his lips twitching. Joining him, she pressed his hand tightly. "You're not angry that I sent for you? I absolutely had to see you," she said, and the serious and set lines of her lips, which he saw under the veil, transformed his mood at once. "I angry? But how have you come? Where from?" "Never mind," she said, laying her hand on his. "Come along. I must talk to you." He saw that something had happened. and that the interview would not be a joyous one. In her presence he had no will of his own. Without knowing the grounds of her distress, he already felt the same distress unconsciously passing over him. "What is it? What?" he asked her, squeezing her hand with his elbow and trying to read her thoughts in her face. She walked on a few steps in silence, gathering up her courage. Then suddenly she stopped. She walked on a few steps in silence, gathering up her courage. Then suddenly she stopped. "I did not tell you yesterday," she began, breathing quickly and painfully, "that coming home with Alexey Alexandrovitch, I told him everything. Told him I could not be his wife, that... and told him everything." He heard her, unconsciously bending her whole figure down to her as though hoping in this way to soften the hardness of her position for her. But directly she had said this, he suddenly drew himself up, and a proud and hard expression came over his face. "Yes, yes, that's better, 1,000 times better. I know how painful it was," he said. But she was not listening to his words. She was reading his thoughts from the expression on his face. She could not guess that that expression arose from the first idea that presented itself to Vronsky, that a duel was now inevitable. The idea of a duel had never crossed her mind, and so she put a different interpretation on this passing expression of hardness. When she got her husband's letter, she knew then at the bottom of her heart that everything would go on in the old way, that she would not have the strength of will to forego her position, to abandon her son, and to join her lover. The morning spent at Princess Tverskaya's had confirmed her still more in this. But this interview was still of the utmost gravity for her. She hoped that this interview would transform her position and save her. If, on hearing this news, he were to say to her resolutely, passionately, without an instant's wavering, "Throw up everything and come with me," she would give up her son and go away with him. But this news had not produced what she had expected in him. He simply seemed as though he were resenting some affront. "It was not in the least painful to me. It happened of itself," she said irritably. "And see," she pulled her husband's letter out of her glove. I understand. I understand," he interrupted her, taking the letter, but not reading it, and trying to soothe her. "The one thing I longed for, the one thing I prayed for, was to cut short this position, so as to devote my life to your happiness." "Why do you tell me that?" she said. "Do you suppose I can doubt it? If I doubted—" "Who's that coming?" said Vronsky suddenly, pointing to the two ladies walking towards them. "Perhaps they know us." And he hurriedly turned off, drawing her after him into a side path. "Oh, I don't care," she said. Her lips were quivering, and he fancied that her eyes looked with strange fury at him from under the veil. "I tell you that's not the point. I can't doubt that. But see what he writes to me. Read it." She stood still again. Again, just as at the first moment of hearing of her rupture with her husband, Vronsky, on reading the letter, was unconsciously carried away by the natural sensation aroused in him by his own relation to the betrayed husband. Now, while he held his letter in his hands, he could not help picturing the challenge, which he would most likely find at home today or tomorrow, and the duel itself, in which, with the same cold and haughty expression that his face was assuming at this moment, he would await the injured husband's shot, after having himself fired into the air. And at that instant there flashed across his mind the thought of what Serpuhovskoy had just said to him, and what he had himself been thinking in the morning, that it was better not to bind himself. And he knew that this thought he could not tell her. Having read the letter, he raised his eyes to her, and there was no determination in them. He saw at once that he had been thinking about it before by himself. She knew that whatever he might say to her, he would not say all he thought. And he knew that her last hope had failed. This was not what she had been reckoning on. "You see the sort of man he is?" she said, with a shaking voice. Forgive me." "But I rejoice at it," Vronsky interrupted. "For God's sake, let me finish," he added, his eyes imploring her to give him time to explain his words. "I rejoice because things cannot possibly remain as he supposes." "Why can't they?" Anna said, restraining her tears and obviously attaching no sort of consequence to what he said. She felt that her fate was sealed. Vronsky meant that after the duel, inevitable, he thought, things could not go on as before. But he said something different. "It can't go on. I hope that now you will leave him. I hope—" He was confused and reddened. "That you will let me arrange and plan our life. Tomorrow," he was beginning. She did not let him go on. "But my child!" she screeched. "You see what he writes? I should have to leave him, and I can't, and I won't do that. But for God's sake, which is better, leave your child or keep up this degrading position?" "To whom is it degrading? To all, and most of all to you." "You say degrading. Don't say that. Those words have no meaning for me," she said in a shaking voice. She did not want him now to say what was untrue. She had nothing left her but his love, and she wanted to love him. "Don't you understand that from that day I loved you, everything has changed for me? For me there is one thing and one thing only, your love. If that's mine, I feel so exalted, so strong, that nothing can be humiliating to me. I am proud of my position, because proud of being proud." She could not say what she was proud of. Tears of shame and despair choked her utterance. She stood still and sobbed. He felt, too, something swelling in his throat and twitching in his nose, and for the first time in his life he felt on the point of weeping. He could not have said exactly what it was touched him so. He felt sorry for her, and he felt he could not help her, and with that he knew that he was to blame for her wretchedness, and that he had done something wrong. "Is not a divorce possible?" he said feebly. She shook her head, not answering. "Couldn't you take your son and still leave him?" "Yes, but it all depends on him. Now I must go to him," she said shortly. Her presentiment that all would again go on in the old way had not deceived her. "On Tuesday I shall be in Petersburg, and everything can be settled." "Yes," she said, "but don't let us talk of any more of it." Anna's carriage, which she had sent away, and ordered to come back to the little gate of the Verdra garden, drove up. Anna said goodbye to Vronsky and drove home. End of chapter 22. Okay, so Vronsky got the letter to meet Anna at 6 o'clock in this garden, so he goes there and he's like, this is gonna be great. Everything is lining up. It's gonna be amazing. I'm gonna see Anna. Anna, beautiful, beautiful Anna. The last time I saw her was wonderful. Obviously, this time I'm gonna see her and it's going to be wonderful. Why am I meeting here? Why am I meeting now? I don't really understand why she wrote in Betsy's letter. Whatever. It's not important. So he goes there, he meets Anna. Anna is bringing not the best of news. And Vronsky is like, all right, she told her husband everything. Obviously, we're going to duel. Obviously, that is what the letter is saying, but not saying we will duel. And I'm going to be injured because I am going to shoot up. But obviously, Alexei is not going to do that. He's obviously going to aim at me because he's the husband. That's what he does. But I don't want to hurt him. I'm just going to aim up. And I think that's so interesting because we had the same conversation that Alexei had the same conversation in his head about what he was going to do. And obviously he was going to aim wide, but what if he got hurt? Like what if Vronsky didn't aim wide or didn't aim up and Alexei got hurt? So obviously they're not going to duel. But Vronsky is convinced that that is what is going to happen. So he's like, well, why can't you just leave? And Anna is like, I need to take my son. It's like, okay, well, why can't you just leave and take your son? And Anna's like, Vronsky, you're a simpleton and you don't understand. You don't get it. And she's like, all I need is to know that you love me. That's all that's gonna fuel me to continue on in life. And Vronsky is like, all right, well, I'm gonna be in Petersburg on Tuesday. Everything will be settled. And that's where that chapter ended. Chapter 23. On Monday, there was the usual sitting of the commission of the 2nd of June. Alexei Alexandrovitch walked into the hall where the sitting was held, greeted the members and the president, as usual, and sat down in his place, putting his hand on the papers laid ready before him. Among these papers lay the necessary evidence and a rough outline of the speech he intended to make. But he did not really need these documents. He remembered every point, and did not think it necessary to go over in his memory what he would say. He knew that when the time came, and when he saw his enemy facing him, and studiously endeavoring to assume an expression of indifference, his speech would flow of itself better than he could prepare it now. He felt that the import of his speech was of such magnitude that every word of it would have weight. Meantime, as he listened to the usual report, he had the most innocent and inoffensive air. No one, looking at his white hands, with their swollen veins and long fingers, so softly stroking the edges of the white paper that lay before him, and at the air of weariness with which his head drooped on one side, would have suspected that in a few minutes a torrent of words would flow from his lips that would arouse a fearful storm, set the members shouting and attacking one another, and force the president to call for order. When the report was over, Alexei Alexandrovitch announced in his subdued, delicate voice that he had several points to bring before the meeting in regard to the Commission for the Reorganization of the Native Tribes. All attention was turned upon him. Alexei Alexandrovitch cleared his throat and, not looking at his opponent, but selecting, as he always did while he was delivering his speeches, the first person sitting opposite him, an inoffensive little old man, who never had an opinion of any sort in the commission, began to expound his views. When he reached the point about the fundamental and radical law, his opponent jumped up and began to protest. Stremov, who was also a member of the commission and also stung to the quick, began defending himself, and altogether a stormy sitting followed. But Alexei Alexandrovitch triumphed, and his motion was carried 3-0 new commissions were appointed, and the next day in a certain Petersburg circle nothing else was talked of but this sitting. Alexei Alexandrovich's success had been even greater than he had anticipated. Next morning, Tuesday, Alexei Alexandrovich, on waking up, recollected with pleasure his triumph of the previous day, and he could not help smiling, though he tried to appear indifferent, when the chief secretary of his department, anxious to flatter him, informed him of the rumors that had reached him concerning what had happened in the commission. Absorbed in business with the chief secretary, Alexei Alexandrovich had completely forgotten that it was Tuesday, the day fixed by him for the return of Anna Arkadyevna, and he was surprised and received a shock of annoyance when a servant came in to inform him of her arrival. Anna had arrived in Petersburg early in the morning. The carriage had been sent to meet her in accordance with her telegram, and so Alexei Alexandrovich might have known of her arrival. But when she arrived, he did not meet her. She was told that he had not yet gone out, but was busy with his secretary. She sent word to her husband that she had come, went to her own room, and occupied herself in sorting out her things, expecting he would come to her. But an hour had passed. He had not come. She went into the dining room on the pretext of giving some directions, and spoke loudly on purpose, expecting him to come out there. But he did not come, though she heard him go to the door of his study as he parted from the chief secretary. She knew that he usually went out quickly to his office, and she wanted to see him before that, so that their attitude to one another might be defined. She walked across the drawing-room and went resolutely to him. When she went into his study, he was in official uniform, obviously ready to go out, sitting at a little table on which he rested his elbows, looking dejectedly before him. She saw him before he saw her, and she saw that he was thinking of her. On seeing her, he would have risen, but changed his mind. Then his face flushed hotly, a thing Anna had never seen before, and he got up quickly and went to meet her, looking not at her eyes, but above them at her forehead and hair. He went on to her, took her by the hand, and asked her to sit down. "I am very glad you have come," he said, sitting down beside her, and obviously wishing to say something. He stuttered. Several times he tried to begin to speak, but stopped. In spite of the fact of that, preparing herself for meeting him, she had schooled herself to despise and reproach him. She did not know what to say to him, and she felt sorry for him. And so the silence lasted for some time. "Is Serosa quite well?" he said, and not waiting for an answer, he added, "I shan't be dining at home today, and I have got to go out directly." "I had thought of going to Moscow," she said. "No. You did quite right to come," he said, and was silent again. Seeing that he was powerless to begin the conversation, she began herself. "Alexei Alexandrovich," she said, looking at him and not dropping her eyes under his persistent gaze at her hair, "I'm a guilty woman. I'm a bad woman. But I am the same as I was, as I told you then, and I have come to tell you that I can change nothing." "I have asked you no question about that," he said, all at once, resolutely and with hatred, looking her straight in the face. "That was what I had supposed." Under the influence of anger, he apparently regained complete possession of all his faculties. "But as I told you then, and have written to you," he said in a thin, shrill voice, "I repeat now that I am not bound to know this. I ignore it. Not all wives are so kind as you, to be in such a hurry to communicate such agreeable news to their husbands." He laid special emphasis on the word agreeable. I shall ignore it so long as the world knows nothing of it, so long as my name is not disgraced. And so I simply inform you that our relations must be just as they have always been, and that only in the event of your compromising me I shall be obliged to take steps to secure my honor. But our relations cannot be the same as always, Anna began in a timid voice, looking at him with dismay. When she saw once more those composed gestures, heard that shrill, childish, and sarcastic voice, her aversion for him extinguished her pity for him, and she felt only afraid. But at all costs she wanted to make clear her position. I cannot be your wife while she began. He laughed, a cold and malignant laugh. The manner of life you have chosen is reflected, I suppose, in your ideas. I have too much respect or contempt, or both. I respect your past and despise your present, that I was far from the words' interpretation you put on my words. Anna sighed and bowed her head. Though indeed I fail to comprehend how, with the independence you show, he went on, getting hot, announcing your infidelity to your husband and seeing nothing reprehensible in it, apparently, you can see anything reprehensible in performing a wife's duties in relations to your husband. Alexey Alexandrovitch, what is it you want of me? I want you not to meet that man here, and to conduct yourself so that neither the world nor the servants can reproach you. Not to see him. That's not much, I think, and in return you will enjoy all the privileges of a faithful wife without fulfilling her duties. That's all I have to say to you. Now it's time for me to go. I'm not dining at home. He got up and moved towards the door. Anna got up too, bowing in silence. He let her pass before him. End of chapter 23. All right. Anna is at Petersburg, and Anna is patiently waiting for Alexei to acknowledge her presence, acknowledge her arrival. And so she's doing these little tasks and keeping an eye on his office door, knowing that as soon as he is done in there, he's gonna just rush out of the house and go to work. And she doesn't want that. She wants to get ahead of the situation and have a discussion with him. And so he opens the door and she's like, hello. And they have a conversation, and Alexei steers the conversation. Basically, what it boils down to: Anna, we're gonna stay together. Anna, you don't have to do your wifely duties with me. Anna, you will not see Vronsky here. We will proceed as society sees us happy. There will be no gossip about us. You will not besmirch my name or position in society. And that's that. That is that. And it's almost like a how dare you tell me, without having any sort of like regret or shame or something along those lines. And Anna does have a response, but it's not very strong. It's not very like, here is my counter offer. Nothing like that. It's kind of bumbling, kind of shocked, kind of reserved in what she probably actually wants to say. Be careful what you wish for. Yeah. There's that. There's that. That's happening here. Chapter 24. The night spent by Levin on the haycock did not pass without result for him. The way in which he had been managing his land revolted him, and had lost all attraction for him. In spite of the magnificent harvest, never had there been, or, at least, never it seemed to him, had there been so many hindrances and so many quarrels between him and the peasants as that year, and the origin of these failures and this hostility was now perfectly comprehensible to him. The delight he had experienced in the work itself, and the consequent greater intimacy with the peasants, the envy he felt of them, of their life, the desire to adopt that life, which had been to him that night not a dream, but an intention, the execution of which he had thought out in detail. All this had so transformed his view of the farming of the land as he had managed it, that he could not take his former interest in it, and could not help seeing that unpleasant relation between him and the work people which was the foundation of it all. The herd of improved cows, such as Pava, the whole land plowed over and enriched, the 9 level fields surrounded with hedges, the 240 acres heavily manured, the seed sown in drills, and all the rest of it. It was all splendid, if only the work had been done for themselves, or for themselves and comrades, people in sympathy with them. But he saw clearly now his work on a book of agriculture, in which the chief element in husbandry was to have been the laborer, greatly assisted him in this. That the sort of farming he was carrying on was nothing but a cruel and stubborn struggle between him and the laborers, in which there was on one side, his side, a continual intense effort to change everything to a pattern he considered better. On the other side, the natural order of things. And in this struggle he saw that, with immense expenditure of force on his side, and with no effort or even intention on the other side, all that was attained was that the work did not go to the liking of either side, and that splendid tools, splendid cattle and land were spoiled with no good to anyone. Worst of all, the energy expended on this work was not simply wasted. He could not help feeling now, since the meaning of this system had become clear to him, that the aim of his energy was a most unworthy one. In reality, what was the struggle about? He was struggling for every farthing of his share, and he could not help it, for he had only to relax his efforts, and he would not have had the money to pay his laborers' wages, while they were only struggling to be able to do their work easily and agreeably. That is to say, as they were used to doing it. It was for his interest that every laborer should work as hard as possible, and that while doing so he should keep his wits about him, so as to try not to break the winnowing machines, the horse rakes, the thrashing machines, that he should attend to what he was doing. What the laborer wanted was to work as pleasantly as possible, with rests, and above all, carelessly and heedlessly, without thinking. That summer, Levin saw this at every step. He sent the men to mow some clover for hay, picking up the worst patches where the clover was overgrown with grass and weeds, and of no use for seed. Again and again, they mowed the best acres of clover, justifying themselves by the pretense that the bailiff had told them to, and trying to pacify him with the assurance that it would be splendid hay. But he knew that it was owing to those acres being so much easier to mow. He sent out a hay machine for pitching the hay. It was broken at the first row because it was dull work for a peasant to sit on the seat in front with the great wings waving above him. And he was told, "Don't trouble, your honor, sure. The women folk will pitch it quick enough." The plows were practically useless, because it never occurred to the laborer to raise the share when he turned the plow, and forcing it round, he strained the horses and tore up the ground, and Levin was begged not to mind about it. The horses were allowed to stray into the wheat because not a single laborer would consent to be night watchman. and in spite of orders to the contrary, the laborers insisted on taking turns for night duty, and Ivan, after working all day long, fell asleep, and was very penitent for his fault, saying, "Do what you will to me, your honor." They killed 3 of the best calves by letting them into the clover aftermath without care as to their drinking, and nothing would make the men believe that they had been blown out by the clover. But they told him, by way of consolation, that one of his neighbors had lost 112 head of cattle in 3 days. All this happened not because anyone felt ill will to Levin or his farm. On the contrary, he knew that they liked him, thought him a simple gentleman, their highest praise. But it happened simply because all they wanted was to work merrily and carelessly. And his interests were not only remote and incomprehensible to them, but fatally opposed to their most just claims. Long before, Levin had felt dissatisfaction with his own position in regard to the land. He saw where his boat leaked, but he did not look for the leak, perhaps purposely deceiving himself. Nothing would be left him if he lost faith in it. But now he could deceive himself no longer. The farming of the land, as he was managing it, had become not merely unattractive, but revolting to him, and he could take no further interest in it. To this now was joined the presence, only 25 miles off, of Kitty Shtcherbatskaya, who he longed to see and could not see. Darya Alexandrovna Oblonskaya had invited him, when he was over there, to come with the object of renewing his offer to her sister, who would, so she gave him to understand, accept him now. Levin himself had felt on seeing Kitty Shtcherbatskaya that he had never ceased to love her, but he could not go over to the Oblonskys knowing she was there. The fact that he had made her an offer and she had refused him had placed an insuperable barrier between him and her. "I can't ask her to be my wife merely because she can't be the wife of the man she wanted to marry," he said to himself. The thought of this made him cold and hostile to her. I should not be able to speak to her without a feeling of reproach. I could not look at her without resentment. She will only hate me all the more. She's bound to. And besides, how can I now, after what Darya Alexandrovna told me, go to see them? Can I help showing that I know what she told me? And me to go magnanimously to forgive her and have pity on her? Me go through a performance before her of forgiving and deigning to bestow my love on her? What induced Darya Alexandrovna to tell me that? By chance I might have seen her. Then everything would have happened of itself. But as it is, it's out of the question. Out of the question. Darya Alexandrovna sent him a letter asking him for a side saddle for Kitty's use. "I'm told you have a side saddle," she wrote to him. "I hope you will bring it over yourself." This was more than he could stand. How could a woman of any intelligence, of any delicacy, put her sister in such a humiliating position? He wrote 10 notes, and tore them all up, and sent the saddle without any reply. To write that he would go was impossible, because he could not go. To write that he could not come because something prevented him, or that he would be away, that was still worse. He sent the saddle without an answer, and with a sense of having done something shameful. He handed over all the now revolting business of the estate to the bailiff, and set off next day to a remote district to see his friend Shvetsky, who was who had splendid marshes for grouse in his neighborhood, and had lately written to him to keep a long-standing promise to stay with him. The grouse marsh in the Surovsky district had long tempted Levin, but he had continually put off his visit on account of his work on the estate. Now he was glad to get away from the neighborhood of the Sherbatskys, and still more from his farm work, especially on the shooting expedition, which always in trouble served as the best consolation. End of chapter 24. All right, we are back with Levin. Simple Levin. The beginning of the chapter, he is just reminiscing on his, his dream to be a simple peasant and how easy their life is because they don't have to make decisions and all of these things. And okay, sure, Levin. But how? How can he do that when he loves Kitty? And how can he go over to Daria's house when he knows that Kitty's there? When Daria practically told him that now Kitty would accept a proposal, which that's not what she said. But I guess that's what we are extrapolating from what she said. It's fine. So Levin is being weird about the whole situation, and instead of actually sending over answers, or instead of actually going over there, he just sends over a saddle for Kitty, and now he's in this big old conundrum and doesn't know what to do. So silly, so silly. Chapter 25. In the Surovsky district, there was no railway or service of post horses, and Levin drove there with his own horses in his big, old-fashioned carriage. He stopped halfway at a well-to-do peasant's to feed his horses. A bald, well-preserved old man, with a broad, red beard, gray on his cheeks, opened the gate, squeezing against the gate-post to let the 3 horses pass, directing the coachman to a place under the shed in the big, clean, tidy yard, with charred, old-fashioned plows in it. The old man asked Levin to come into the parlor. A cleanly dressed young woman, with clogs on her bare feet, was scrubbing the floor in the new outer room. She was frightened of the dog, that ran in after Levin and uttered a shriek, but began laughing at her own fright at once when she was told the dog would not hurt her. Pointing Levin with her bare arm to the door into the parlor, she bent down again, hiding her handsome face, and went on scrubbing. "Would you like the samovar?" she asked. "Yes, please." The parlor was a big room, with a Dutch stove, and a screen dividing it into 2. Under the holy pictures stood a table painted in patterns, a bench, and 2 chairs. Near the entrance was a dresser full of crockery. The shutters were closed. There were few flies, and it was so clean that Levin was anxious that Laska, who had been running along the road and bathing in puddles, should not muddy the floor, and ordered her to a place in the corner by the door. After looking round the parlor, Levin went out in the backyard. The good-looking young woman in clogs, swinging the empty pails on the yoke, ran on before him to the well for water. "Look sharp, my girl," the old man shouted after her, good-humoredly, and he went up to Levin. "Well, sir, are you going to Nikolay Ivanovitch Shivsky's? His honor comes to us too," he began, chatting, leaning his elbows on the railing of the steps. In the middle of the old man's account of his acquaintance with Shivsky, the gates creaked again, and laborers came into the yard from the fields with wooden plows and harrows. The horses harnessed to the plows and harrows were sleek and fat. The laborers were obviously of the household. 2 were young men in cotton shirts and caps. The 2 others were hired laborers in homespun shirts, one an old man, the other a young fellow. Moving off from the steps, the old man went up to the horses and began unharnessing them. "What have they been plowing?" asked Levin. "Plowing up the potatoes. We rent a bit of land there. 2. Fedot, don't let out the gelding, but take to the trough and we'll put the other harness in." "Oh, father, the plowshares I ordered. Has he brought them along?" asked the big, healthy-looking fellow, obviously the old man's son. "There, in the outer room," answered the old man, bundling together the harness he had taken off and flinging it on the ground. "You can put them on while they have dinner." The good-looking young woman came into the outer room with the full pails dragging at her shoulders. More women came on the scene from somewhere, young and handsome, middle-aged, old and ugly, with children and without children. The samovar was beginning to sing. The laborers and the family, having disposed of the horses, came in to dinner. Levin, getting his provisions out of his carriage, invited the old man to take tea with him. "Well, I have some today already," said the old man, obviously accepting the invitation with pleasure. "But just a glass for company." Over their tea, Levin heard all about the old man's farming. 10 years before, the old man had rented 300 acres from the lady who owned them, and a year ago he had bought them and rented another 300 from a neighboring landowner. A small part of the land, the worst part, he let out for rent, while 100 acres of arable land he cultivated himself with his family and 2 hired laborers. The old man complained that things were doing badly, but Levin saw that he simply did so from a feeling of propriety, and that his farm was in a flourishing condition. If it had been unsuccessful, he would not have bought land at 35 rubles the acre. He would not have married his 3 sons and nephew. He would not have rebuilt twice after fires, and each time on a larger scale. In spite of the old man's complaints, it was evident that he was proud, and justly proud, of his prosperity, proud of his sons, his nephew, his sons' wives, his horses and his cows, and especially of the fact that he was keeping all this farming going. From his conversation with the old man, Levin thought he was not averse to new methods either. He had planted a great many potatoes, and his potatoes, as Levin had seen driving past, were already fast flowering and beginning to die down, while Levin's were only just coming into flower. He earthed up his potatoes with a modern plow borrowed from a neighboring landowner. He sowed wheat. The trifling fact that, thinning out his rye, the old man used the rye he thinned out for his horses, specially struck Levin. How many times had Levin seen this splendid fodder wasted and tried to get it saved? But always it had turned out to be impossible. The peasant got this done, and he could not say enough in praise of it as food for the beasts. "What have the wenches to do?" "They carry it out in bundles to the roadside, and the cart brings it away." "Well, we landowners can't manage well with our laborers," said Levin, handing him a glass of tea. "Thank you," said the old man, and he took the glass, but refused sugar, pointing to a lump he had left. "There's simple destruction," he said. "Look at Schwisky's, for instance. We know what the land's like, first rate, yet there's not much of a crop to boast of. It's not looked after enough. That's all it is." "But you work your land with hired laborers?" "We're all peasants together. We go into everything ourselves. If a man's no use, he can go, and we can manage by ourselves." "Father, Finnegan wants tar," said the young woman in the clogs, coming in. Yes, that's how it is, sir," said the old man, getting up and crossing himself deliberately. He thanked Levin and went out. When Levin went into the kitchen to call his coachman, he saw the whole family at dinner. The women were standing up waiting on him. The young, sturdy-looking son was telling something funny with his mouth full of pudding, and they were all laughing. The woman in the clogs, who was pouring cabbage soup into a bowl, laughing most merrily of all. Very probably, the good-looking face of the young woman in the clogs had a good deal to do with the impression of well-being this peasant household made upon Levin. But the impression was so strong that Levin could never get rid of it. And all the way from the old peasants to Schwisky's, he kept recalling this peasant's farm as though there were something in this impression that demanded his special attention. End of chapter 25. Okay, chapter 25, Levin goes on a little field trip to this other farm, and he's noticing as he's coming in that the crops are doing really well. The potatoes are doing much better than his potatoes. In fact, they're already like beyond flowering and producing potatoes, whereas Levin's potatoes are just now getting to flower. And so the old man is doing very well. He's also one of the laborers, like he works alongside, his whole family works alongside all of these laborers, all of these paid laborers, and the old man is also not afraid to change things, to try something new instead of being stuck in an old way, and Levin makes note of that, and as he's noticing all of the success that he's having on this farm. And the old man is talking about like, well, yeah, like sometimes we have to let laborers go and they go their own way, but that doesn't really impact us because we're already doing all of the work. Like even like the women are helping and like doing this task, and like the boys are doing this task, like whatever it is. And Levin's like almost obsession with being a simple folk and being a peasant and being, you know, a laborer is being reflected in what he's seeing with this family. And it is another example of a family that Levin is getting. Because it is, you know, he wants to settle down, he wants to be married, he wants to have a family, all of these things. And he's taking note of all of these different families in his area as examples. Because we know that he thinks that Daria's children are just very spoiled and they are too highfalutin, and why would we want them to speak French? That is just taking away from their actual character. But these fine folk, they know how to do it. So, you know, gotta get different varieties of families after all, of course. But I guess that's where we're gonna end. That's where we'll end today. We are 40% of the way through. Look at us go. Which really, it is longer because there are notes at the end. Or farther. We're farther along than 40%, but I'm going to pretend like we're not, so that it'll be a nice surprise at the end. So yes, thank you all so much for being here. It is a pleasure. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. If I do not see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Bye.